Coming up on the Fulcrum Global Podcast, we discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the responses by the United States, NATO, China, and other world players. How does this impact the future of the international system? And what national security obstacles will the U.S. need to overcome? Find out now. Stand by for Fulcrum Global. Welcome to another episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast, where friends and peers get together to discuss and brainstorm on issues and trends impacting the world of national security, defense, intelligence, and foreign affairs. I'm Sam Kessler, the host, chief editor of Fulcrum Global. For those of you who don't know what Fulcrum Global is or does, it's the digital media platform of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at American Military University. And today we have a podcast episode for you. It's our fifth one, first of the year. And we've had a lot of interesting events happening in the world. And we were going to have another type of podcast, but that got canceled. So we decided to be resilient and to make the best of it and do what we would call a roundtable discussion, which I think gives the opportunity to provide a valuable discussion for people watching it. Our guests today are all members of SDSS, actually. Some are officers, but others are contributors. Actually, all of you are contributors of Fulcrum Global in one shape or form, whether as a writing contributor, a podcast contributor, a peer reviewer. So it's really neat to have that type of group to come and discuss, because you guys really help make Fulcrum Global what it is. And it's great to really see the result of all that. Today, we're going to do a few issues, and obviously the one that's on a lot of people's minds is the war between Russia and Ukraine and the situation with the US and NATO and, of course, China. So we're going to do a conversation centered around that, but there's going to be other topics to discuss that are on other people's minds. But I want to thank you all for coming here, and I just realized I need to introduce you guys first. I apologize for that. We have Dr. Mark Kass, we have Max Daves, we have Dustin Oaks, and we have Nabil Rahman, and we also have Brian Moody. Welcome here. I just want to thank you all again. So what are you guys' thoughts on what's going on in the world? Max, what are your thoughts on Russia, Ukraine? I know this is a thing that you've been following for a good while now, and you've talked to a lot of people, and it seems like it's been evolving in a certain manner that you have to start questioning what exactly it means for the international system, because everyone's talking about international affairs in terms of realism or the liberal international order, the rules-based order, and how the world is evolving from what was a unipolar power to a multipolar power. And then you have all the stuff going on around Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a lot to bite off all at once. So let me just focus on one thing at a time. Let's address the unipolar, multipolar thing as a kind of a background. First off, the natural state of the world prior to really what we would call, the post World War I, World War II, 20th century, right? But going even further back, you can see the roots. We'll stay away from that. We'll just keep it simple. We emerged as the hegemon. We emerged as the unipole. And when you emerge as that, as the dominant power, you make the rules. And because of our system, we tried to put our system into what the world order should be. Albeit, I think, we didn't go far enough with checks and balances, especially when you deal with the UN, but that's another discussion. But the general reality of the world, even during the rising and falling of empires in history, has been multipolar. It's been multipolar and multi-regional, and within those regions, multipolar. And so this is not new. A lot of folks thought that it could be a different version of it. And of course, history rhymes more than it repeats. But the effects of it, I like to use the term, as for people, so too for nations. If you look at what a multipolar psychology usage of that term looks like, it's a fractured personality, right? And so when you apply that at the macros and look at what has occurred and occurring in the world, just like within a fractured personality, there's chaos and confusion and dysfunction. And so as we enter into this increasingly turbulent world that I would say has been engineered, right? It's been engineered to be this way. You've got the emergent powers of China, right? And then regional powers like Iran, and then of course the Saudis and the UAE and the folks within the Arabian sphere of influence. But how all this plays into Ukraine is interesting because Putin has done a very good job at using what he has and leveraging it to elevate even beyond, I think, what Russia's real power is, to a position of, I can't say a superpower, but I would say that he's a dominant world power now. And a lot of that is because of our own mistakes. And I don't think we did what we needed to do after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, that brings us to Ukraine. Ukraine has always been a very interesting place, has a long history, and it has always played a role in wars within Europe and world wars in the last century. So there's a lot of fear surrounding it. And because of that, that amplifies the EU and NATO and the West in general's point of view on it. Plus, there's a hangover from the Soviet days and the Cold War. So that being the case, we can't go back and fix what we should have done. So here we are, and Russia is doing what Russia has always done, going back to Imperial Russia. They want to protect their vast territories. And in this form, it's less Soviet and more Imperial Russia, Tsarist, right? And so when you think about their predicament, you put yourself in their shoes, they've got a lot of problems. It's a very difficult territory historically to protect, a lot of history from the East and the West. And the social issues that they have and the decreasing population also poses significant risks. And then it's not necessarily, I know Russian folks like to use the Russian ethnicity, but really it's a multi-ethnic society. And to hold that together within the context of a decidedly autocratic society is difficult. So that increases the complexity they have to deal with, and it also increases the fear, which is why it is that they want to have more control on their periphery. And the Ukraine has always been a fly in the ointment, right? It goes back to Catherine the Great and wanting to have that for a number of reasons. It has a lot of natural resources, and it's the breadbasket. It's been typically the breadbasket for that region. And so when you think of that, and you think of the problems coming down line, I mean, we could go into a lot of cascades on it, but we'll stay away from that to keep it simple. There's a lot of fear in Russia, and some of it's rightfully so. But where Russia really wanted to be was closer to the West. They really wanted to be closer to the United States and to Europe. But that comes with its own problems, right? And fears, typically, and those are historical as well. So when you look at where we're at with the Ukraine, I think Russia made a very bad mistake. I think there's a possibility that they were also lured into it in other ways. for a lot of reasons, political, economic, and otherwise. But it's a terrible decision by Putin and the Kremlin, because what they really wanted, they actually have destroyed, at least in the short to mid-term, without a great deal of humbling. And the destruction that's been rendered and the way that it's occurring has also reopened those wounds from those former satellites of the Soviet Union, right? Poland.
It brings back a lot of memories. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And so it's actually done the opposite that I think they wanted in some ways in the short term. Now, here's an interesting thing in the long term. It actually may potentially benefit them if they are able to extract themselves from the mess they've gotten themselves into and maintain power. Because ultimately, Russia's biggest threat is not from the West, it is China. And they have more in common with us, ironically enough, and the West in general, culturally and otherwise. That really is, if there's one thing that is probably the biggest problem that they have now, is that they've really hurt themselves in terms of being able to make that happen. Now, we can dive in if you want, Sam, and I don't want to, I think everybody else, I'd like to hear what they think about what I've just talked about, you know, in terms of how the multipolar, and then we can go on, maybe if you wanted to do more tactical dives into what's going on in Ukraine, we could do that, but I'm going to let you guide us on that. All right.
Well, with the multipolar aspect, it really ties in with their long-term foreign policy from the early 90s, when they realized their weaknesses. And I don't think they're like the preeminent superpower, but in a multipolar system, they're definitely up there in terms of I guess you could say relevancy, or I don't know, I don't know about power projection, but
well, I think that's a fair word to use. I think they're using what they have extremely effectively, and they have managed to exponentially increase their influence again beyond what economically, if you based it just on economics and demographics, a lot of policy wonks would have thought, right? But they're superpower from a nuclear point of view, right?
Absolutely. But they managed to do certain strategies on a beer budget at the same time, in a sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What are people's
Very clever
thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, one thing I think that kind of plays into this about the dominant superpower and or just projecting strength is whenever you look at the UN votes and how many countries are abstaining. I mean, the same bad actors are going to vote no every time to support the same bad actors. But the real look is all the countries that abstain. You have a good chunk of the Asian countries abstaining, pretty much all of Africa, and predominantly most of South America are abstaining. And I think that really does play into this whole, that superpower status has been kind of marginalized for Russia. They are a superpower because of their nuclear threat, but they are still, even though their superpower status is marginalized and that the Ukraine war is not going as well as everybody had predicted, including our own general, our own military staff. I believe General Milley said that Kiev would be caught in 72 hours or capitulate in 72 hours. And we're now entering the second month of the war. So as far as being able to still project strength, Russia is obviously doing that because a lot of countries abstained from condemning their actions in Ukraine and then abstained from voting them off the Human Rights Council on the UN.
Yeah, well said. I agree. That's a good point.
Let's examine a great discussion, gentlemen. Let's examine some of the main players in this, in quotes, abstention. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, India, I mean, these are some heavy players. The Emirates ain't that heavy, but India and the Saudis. The Saudis ostensibly will not even take Biden's calls right now. Are you kidding me? After all that we have done with the Saudis, regardless of the presidential administration, and then India, who basically turned away from the Soviets and turned away from Putin, is now kind of hands off, backing off. Now that to me, I'm sorry, I'm very emotional about this, but this galls the hell out of me. The fact that the Saudis and the Indians are behaving in this manner. I can understand other countries being hesitant. The other thing that really galls me is Israel. Israel is very hands-off here. Now, a lot of it has to do with what's going on north in Syria, where the Israelis and the Russians have had a pact, in quotes, for maybe 10 years as to who gets whom, or when the Israelis can come in and smash up the Iranians. So it's a very complicated situation, but there's, I know we have to deal with it unemotionally, but there's a lot of galling factors involved here. And the third thing I'd like to mention, based upon both your excellent discussions, is how the former Soviet bloc countries have responded to this, with the exception of maybe Hungary and Serbia. It's just phenomenal to me.
That's really key right there.
Yeah.
For the future, what's
Right.
happening. More so than NATO, actually.
I think so.
That's because what you just said, I think, develop that a little more, because I'd like to hear what you think about those former Soviet satellites.
Basically, it goes back to, for example, today, there was a drone strike right over a Russian drone strike, in quotes, mistake. We all know that that's not the case, over Poland, or slightly into Polish territory. So the other implication is that if and when, with a big if, the Ukrainians are dissolved, then it's Poland and the whole Eastern Bloc, and with Belarus as a launching point. So, it's hard for us to imagine what that would be like. I was talking with someone the other day. It would be like, I live in Kansas. It would be like Texas being Russia, because we're distanced from this. They're not. And the fact also, and I'll cut off in a second here, the fact that the Swedes and the Finns are talking about, more the Swedes are thinking about joining NATO, that's phenomenal. But it's also, you have this giant power entity next to you, and you have to find faith in numbers. So,
And for decades, they've been managing that independence for a very long time. And that you could almost say they became masters of that in terms of handling it. But
Do you think that those former Soviet satellites like Poland and the Czech Republic and all the way around the Horn, Romania and Ukraine, you think they'll there's been talks about them forming their own NATO EU hybrid like organization. In fact, I had a conversation a couple of days ago on a Ukraine work group about that. It might be a alternative to expansion of NATO, right? And I don't think NATO wants that, but it might be an alternative.
I get the sense the Poles are trying to really take a greater charge in terms of managing it. Whether they do it effectively, I don't know, because it affects their EU relationship as well. So
that could have a huge impact on the future. I mean, the Poles are shouldering a lot of the burden on this right now. So, and when you look at the future trajectory for them, I mean, they're rising as a regional power.
mm-hmm.
I mean, and there's a lot of folks that would say, and I think they're not inaccurate in this, is that the Poles are really going to unseat Germany as the dominant power in some ways over the next, 10 to 20 years or so, right? And it makes sense that they would make that play, right? But what do you guys think about how that would affect what Russia would do? Because, I mean, this whole region is really on the edge. The fuse has been lit and the powder keg is sitting there, right? So what do you think that kind of talk could lead to?
Well, I think the Soviet bloc countries, the Soviet satellites, are viewing this more of an existential threat than the US is, which is why those countries are trying to kind of aggressively lead the charge and, expand into, a possible different organization, say, like the NATO East or, something like that, something that takes it away. However, I feel that by doing that, that would really kind of chip away with NATO's stronghold, and it really weakens the whole Article 5, because if you have, say, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, some of those countries kind of create their own NATO and be like, hey, we're going to create our own little wall here. We're going to be NATO's front lines. Would the rest of the alliance be like, still count on Article 5? Be like, okay, you guys did your own security alliance. Now Article 5 is no longer in play here, and you guys are on your own. So there's a lot of tension in that area, and they obviously think that Russia is an existential threat, which the US is not there yet. The US is not thinking that this is, at least a viewpoint from the administration and the way the administration's been acting. It does not seem that the administration views Russia as an existential threat to the security throughout Europe and throughout the world.
I think that's really quite interesting, considering throughout history, as we got into a more multipolar shift in the balance of power, NATO was pretty much established to keep Russian power at bay, wasn't it? Like, that was the whole reason for its establishment. The move that Putin is making to try and take back the Ukraine is probably because of the Western influence that is spilling over into the Ukraine in the first place. There has been talks about the influence about Ukraine possibly joining NATO. And on top of that, I think what is happening is that Putin really fears the expansion of NATO because it really takes away any possible chance of him reestablishing imperial power over the region. So he's probably acting with haste, if anything. We all know that from Ukraine's history that it established itself as a republic in 1917 after the Bolshevik overthrow of the Tsar. And in 1991, there was the Declaration of Independence shortly after. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and it really had a hard time reestablishing its power throughout Central Asia.
That's a good point. I mean, do you guys think that Putin really wants to take all of Ukraine, or do you think it's just part of it? I mean, to take all of Ukraine and hold it, let's just put it into real politique terms, right? That is going to be a long-term effort, unless his military, I mean, if his military performed like everybody thought it would, right? It'd be maybe a different calculus, right? But I think what's interesting, and I've talked to a few people about this and listened to some others about it, is that, it's kind of the old art of the war, right? Do a feint to the east, right? And then hit the west. Well, I mean, there's multiple versions of that. So there's multiple stratagems you link together. And so when everybody was focused on Kiev, they were taking ground in the east. So it's not pretty. And I would agree that they've not done very well, but I'm not sure I buy the fact that Russia really wants to hold the ground for all of Ukraine. I think they want key things. I think they want a crescent, right, from the east, from Donbass all the way around to Odessa, because they want control of the Black Sea, and what that means for them in terms of not only economically, right, which is a big thing, but also from a military and strategic point of view, right? Do you guys see that differently, or do you see it? What do you think Putin's objectives are? Or do you think he's just going adaptively, right?
Well, for me, I see it as he's going to make the play for the entire country and hold it because of the history behind it. And now with his invasion, he went back and violated the agreement from 1994 called the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine had to give up all their nuclear weapons, and Russia agreed that they would never attack them again as long as they didn't have nuclear weapons. Well, fast forward, here we are, and in that same time frame, Putin's came out numerous times and said that he wants to reunite the former Soviet Union. And so with Ukraine and their resources that they have and their access to the Black Sea and to the open sea, it's a very strategic spot for them because they can develop more stealth and more classified material within the Black Sea because it's more of a confined environment. And if they can control the access into the Black Sea, then they can do more with that. And back to Brian's comment earlier, talking about the polarity and everything, Russia has been able to essentially overexpand their resources, if you will, in terms of manpower, because they've been active in South America. When Hugo Chavez passed away, they moved in. They were securing the banks. Right. Yeah. They were securing the banks. They were using Wagner Group. They have all the accessibility to military equipment as the GRU. And then I've had friends in Sudan and Congo and stuff that have fed me information. They're like, hey, yeah, we're seeing a lot of these guys now, and they're employing a lot of electronic warfare. And so, they're expanding their reaches out there, as well as, we had some issues with them coming back in Afghanistan in 2014 to rekindle ties there that were still loyal and stuff. And so circling it back into more Europe and that new central protection of the former Soviet blocs, 2013, I was doing some research, and they're really targeting the Czech Republic's nuclear reactors. There were not only them, but the Chinese were there too. They were trying to assess it and see and monitor it. So I think they need the resources. But I see Putin's plan for Ukraine to take it and hold it. And I said this once, said it twice. No one believed me. Now I'm making a statement for the rest of the former Soviet bloc. I'm coming for you. And so I can see him doing it. Will it be easy? No. But the thing that they have that's been interesting me, and Sam and I have talked about this on the cyber front, are the ability, the plethora of non-state actors that carry out activities on their behalf. The FBI just stopped this botnet just recently, but that's just one thing. They have the capability across the entire former Soviet bloc to include organizations within Ukraine that are helping them on their behalf. So I could see it happening. Will it be short term? No, because I think they underestimated the Ukrainians' will to fight and will to actually have their own free choice. And I don't think they really thought it through. And the Ukrainians were really relying on NATO to kind of help them. And everyone's taking a hands-off approach because of geopolitical issues, natural gas for Europe, food costs for the US, oil prices going up. So, it's kind of a sticking point for me on why he moved so quickly. Because if you look at Georgia and Crimea, it was a lengthy, drawn-out process of putting people in place to help stir up violence and to create situations where it fits their constitution that if any interest or any Russian people were a threat or felt threatened, that Putin could declare war or take military action without having his government's approval. And that's exactly what they did with Crimea. They did it with Georgia. And they went straight through Crimea and up through. So, roundabout answer, I think it can happen. And I think it's happening, like you were just saying, in a sleight of hand move that we're not seeing.
Well, you bring up a really interesting point, and that it's Putin and his Wagner group, right? It's almost like a page out of Soleimani's strategy, right? And I would say that that's maybe where he got it from. I mean, that is, the Iranians were very effective. And I think that they work together because of their relationship with the Russians. And I think that that's part of their plan, because the Iranians are also involved, and have been in Central America. And so you've got all those things at play. And again, to your point, where Putin and the Kremlin have been very effective is leveraging what they don't have by using others to do it from a proxy. It's a repackaging of the proxy approaches that were used during the Cold War, but in a much more clever way. And I think also another important point that you bring up on that is how he's turned the Russian nationalism into a Russian ethnicity issue, right? Which is kind of what, he's borrowed that from the Palestinians, right? And borrowed that from the left here in a lot of ways. So they're very good at adapting. And, you do have a point. I mean, I think, again, if he had been more successful on the front end with the Ukraine, I think he would have gone all in. The problem he faces is that because it's becoming a can't even say the word, I'm so tired.
Projection.
Well, sort of, right? Because it's become a longer crisis. How about that? Because of that, he's actually creating vulnerabilities to his east. And let me give you an example, all right? So I was asked to present some options in the war. And I'm like, okay, if you really want to do this, you're going to have to take pressure off, or you're going to have to think bigger, right, than Ukraine, and you're going to have to create a pressure release. Now, to do that, that means you're going to have to think to the east, because they're very vulnerable. And here's another thing where I think that they miscalculated. Russia did not develop their infrastructure nationally. They don't have superhighways across the whole country. They have rail, and that is extremely vulnerable. So that if you take out rail, you're left with a relatively undeveloped highway system, right? That's also vulnerable in key places. And that leaves you with one thing, because they really, two, if you're gonna include C, but in this case, they have to run the gauntlet. But how they plan to use their forces across is to move them through rail. Well, when that's gone, they're left with air. And some of that is through easily contested areas. And when you look at the type of effects that the weapon systems are having on them, just in the Ukraine, with the limited use and the limited numbers, it's putting a hurt on them. They can extend their time in the Ukraine by doing what Putin is doing, like kind of, it's out of the playbook of the Romans back during the occupation of Judea, using the Assyrians. And that's what the Romans were good at. After a certain point, they would develop proxy forces and then include them into the legion, right? So the problem he has with that is that when you're using those kinds of forces, just like the Romans did, you have the same problems the Romans had. And that is, you don't have control as much as you would like over them. And that can create a huge problem in terms of cascade effects. And when you're using mercenaries, right? When you're using mercs, well, that's a dollars game. That's a money game. And when you're paying people, right, to do your dirty work, it's kind of like any other thing. Like, think about the mob, right? Because in a sense, what you see happening with Ukraine and Russia is like two competing mob families. It's more like that than people actually want to talk about it publicly, because they're mirror images of one another in some ways. They're not exactly the same by any means. but they're both run by oligarchs. And they both have a lot of corruption, right? And I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Ukraine couldn't get into NATO or the EU. They couldn't meet those obligations. So in many ways, they're mirror images. But that's dangerous too when you start to rely on paid help, because somebody else can always come in and pay them more for a short period of time and scuttle what you're doing. So it gets into the concept of war as a service, which we, maybe we'll have a roundtable discussion on some other time, because I think it's very important. We were talking about the multipolar order that's developing. But when you look at that from that point of view, he can't hold both. He can't be in a long protracted war there. Domestically, it's not going to work. He can only manipulate the public there so long as the body bags come back, or no one comes back because they've been turned to ashes.
Yeah.
Which is why he's doing it, right? Because he remembers what happened during Afghanistan. The body bags coming back there. I think I agree with you. I think he's bit off more than he can chew. What's interesting about this is China.
Yes.
Because if anybody stands to gain, it's China, right? And what is China's biggest need? Well, resources. And if over the long period, if this really gets into a long protracted conflict, right, in Ukraine, and he gets tied down and he starts losing assets to the east, well, it's a big temptation to go after those oil fields at some point, right? Especially if Russia starts getting destabilized, right? So you can see how you can game it out a lot of different ways. And I'm not saying that's a likely scenario anytime soon, but I'm saying it's a dangerous game when you've got that much territory, I don't know. I mean, and that's not even dealing with the ME. And when you start getting with, like you were saying, when you start dealing with Saudi Arabia and Iran and the UAE, what the UAE has is a lot of money. And when you're in an age where it's war as a service, that money can buy a lot of temporary help militarily to do things.
A lot of the UAE's, sorry not to cut you off, but a lot of the UAE's infrastructure right now is built off of black market money coming from Russia and the Russia business network. And so that was what makes me think Dr. Kass's comment on Israel's hands-off approach because of the Russian business network. Everyone says no one knows where it's at and everything, but there's a heavy presence and a heavy understanding from a lot of people that it's operated and based out of Israel. And so they could have, that influence and pull as well to help prevent the parts of the Middle East from coming in and intervening in any mean.
Well, it's a dangerous game.
It is a dangerous game. And let me take a slightly different tack than that will lead to China. First off, estimates are that Putin's lost 15 to 20,000 soldiers, depending on where you get that information. 15 to 20,000. As horrible as Vietnam was, we lost 55,000. That doesn't talk about the number of people injured. 15 to 25,000 people in a month. The second aspect of it is, and I appreciate Mitt Romney more and more, especially in the 2000, even though I didn't support him, in the 2012 presidential debate, he tried to say that you're missing the boat. And everyone thought, well, now attention is going to be paid to Russia everywhere. I mean, all our spy apparatus and telecommunications, it's all going to be focused on he's not going to do anything that we don't know about and we don't publicize, because that's Biden's approach, is to publicize this, which I think makes sense. The next aspect is, let's go over to China. You're exactly right. The Chinese already have North Korea on their doorstep, and they've isolated them totally because they're scared to death of them. They won't allow North Koreans to work in China, or maybe they're coming back again. So Russia in essence becomes one huge North Korea, a much more dangerous North Korea to them. And the other aspect of it is, The Chinese are very clever. I love them, but I hate them too.
I totally understand what you mean by that. Yeah.
I'm a lover of Chinese history, and I speak a little Mandarin, blah, blah, blah. But the Chinese are paying attention here. Notice what's happening with Taiwan right now. They are not doing much of anything. In fact, Nancy Pelosi was going to go over there, and they were raising a ruckus about it. So the Chinese are well aware of our power that could be. In fact, they're trying to redefine a new trade network now. As what was it, the one that was canceled by Trump? Well, now they're revitalizing that with Australia,
the TTP or TPP, yes, or whatever. Yeah,
yeah, I think it's
South
TPP.
Korea.
Yeah.
So they're reimagining that, but the Chinese are very hesitant right now, and understandably so. And do you think they like the Russians? No way. They've hated them for centuries. So
yeah,
it's
literally.
It's an interesting situation. Yes, China is really understanding Mr. Xi is really much more interesting. It's not more interesting, but they're a more devilish player in quotes than Putin is, because Putin is a blunt instrument.
Mm-hmm. He's their bulldog, right?
Yes.
I think that's a fair statement. I hope I didn't cut you off or anything.
No. Go ahead. Sorry.
I think the big question that everybody is wondering about with the Russia-Ukraine situation is, what is Putin's end goal or strategy going to be if things go south for him? Because he does face a lot of pressure from the international community, but because, as we've already noticed, that Russia has had quite a influence over many countries, especially in Africa and the Middle East, that's probably why the international community is a bit in disarray in opposing him. And it seems more of the West is the ones that's pretty much acting as humanitarians, including nonprofit organizations. All sorts of human rights groups are criticizing the Russia-Ukraine situation. Now, with the use of Putin supposedly using mercenaries in Ukraine, I think that is going to already be a violation of international law, as we've already seen that's happened with the Simon Manning situation that happened in Africa. And also with the use of mercenaries, it's more like he's not going to be able to micromanage. The mercenaries are going to go to the highest bidder. So, and the rules of war can be kind of thrown off the table. And the casualties of mercenaries may not exactly be reported in this conflict that happens.
Well, I think the mercenaries will remain as loyal as long as they have enough work from their employer too. I mean, that's
we got to remember too who's running it, because like the direct connection between Wagner Group and GRU is a former GRU commander and friend to Putin. And I've always said the ability that Russians have, same thing with the Chinese, that we don't see in the United States as much anymore, is that ability to pull that ethnicity string of do it for Mother Russia, do it for China. Your family will be proud of you. Or if you don't do this for us, we will execute your family.
That's a great point.
That's a string that we don't see in the younger generations in the US. I contracted for years, and everyone throws that label on me as a mercenary. I'm like, no,
there's a difference.
I did everything for this country, and it was to pay the bills because of what I needed from my family. And I didn't want my kids having to go through stuff that I saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, the younger generations now is like, I don't care. It's not happening here. And lo and behold, you know, a lot of people in Ukraine never thought that they would be fighting for their life. And now they're signing up, you know, by the droves. And so I think that's the big difference dealing with like Wagner Group, is there's a much deeper motivation than just money.
You're absolutely right. And that makes them highly dangerous. I mean, again, it goes back, Putin has been very clever is narratives, right? His narratives are very unified to unify his people, and then to hit demographics everywhere else from a propaganda point of view, because he tells the folks, the older folks, right, in Russia, he uses the Soviet era language. The younger folks, he uses different language sets. And I mean, getting into worldview, then you've got the Eastern Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox Church, right? And so he plays those cards, and you can see how that plays out in the narrative warfare that's being waged both here and around the world by him. It's brilliantly done. And in every one of those cases, he's been able to unify these divergent groups, right? They've typically been divergent, right, for the last 100 years or more, right? And brought them into an umbrella of Mother Russia, like you're saying. You're absolutely right. And given them all a piece, a role to play, right? And you can ask Sam, I'm always talking about how to bring people together, right? Russia has done the negative, the dark version of what I've been trying to get us to do here in the United States and the West in the right way. But you see, our divisions are a mirror opposite of what they've been able to accomplish using the right approach for the wrong reasons.
Well, and one thing, as the war progresses, I think you're going to see more people recommitting to the process, whether it's in Ukraine or elsewhere, and Russia too, because everyone has propaganda on one side, and they'll use these narratives to their advantage. One thing you're right, Max, is how Putin is very consistent with how he promotes the narratives. I mean, a lot of the stuff that people are hearing for the first time, he's been talking about it for years. And one thing I've always done the last several years is I've always watched the annual victory or patriotic parade, which commemorates the victory over the Nazis. That's very important. And not just the parades. I mean, there's actually, you get to see some updates to what they're doing, but also there's a lot of messaging too. When you look at how they're presenting themselves, and then you listen to Putin's speech. That's every year is a little different, and it kind of gives you an idea of how he's trying to prepare people for various narratives. And the last spring it's amazing. That was a year ago. I was trying to, when I heard it, I believe the final year where they officially won, where they're commemorate, I think it was like 1945 or 1946. I think it was like, I forget what the year, but it was a very big milestone for defeating the Nazis. And he used fascism and Nazism as key talking points in the narratives. And I was trying to figure out, who is he calling, because he was talking about modern day, he's talking about trying to go about modern day. And I know he's been talking about Ukraine, but at the time I thought he was talking about the other two 20,000-pound gorillas in the world, but I did not consider Ukraine as part of that element. But I thought that was an interesting speech. And with everything transpiring, I was like, well, it could be other stuff too. I don't know. But I thought it's always interesting. I would definitely recommend, if you like a good military parade, they do a decent parade. But there's always like good messages you can find out to get an idea of what they're trying to tell their armed forces and their people. And going back to Ukraine, because I know you guys were talking about whether he was trying to take over all of Ukraine or just parts of it. I think the original strategy was to try to get them to change their policy towards NATO and their policy to Moscow. I mean, you have to realize there's a history with NATO, Ukraine, and Russia. And, you've had a few revolutions going back and forth. And that's a long story, but it all ties in together. I mean, that's why you had what happened in Crimea. And, Crimea is for a few reasons. I mean, that's a very historical place for them. And it's an important naval port. And dates back to Peter the Great. And it was important to them from that angle. But I honestly think that their goal was to actually make Ukraine a buffer as a proxy, basically to manage. But you have all these forces going back and forth with each other in terms of maneuvering influence in Ukraine. And Ukraine's a very complicated place politically, economically, socially. And it just seems like it was a place that was ready to have more issues going forward. I guess that's putting it nicely.
At the same time, should we really be surprised as to Putin trying to take the Ukraine in the first place? Because I believe there was a stir up earlier, back when Obama was still president, about Russia and the Ukraine situation. It wasn't to the extent as we see now, but you did see that he had a quite vested interest in it.
Well, you bring up a great timeline point, because you're right. I was just thinking about the Obama administration, right? Things were good to about 2012. In 2012, I would dare say that under the Obama administration, I'm not saying specifically Obama himself, President Obama, but I would say that it probably is leaning more towards what I guess the right-wing folks would call more the entrenched bureaucracy in terms of the foreign policy side of things. They really made some bad policy decisions. And I remember warning about the Middle East in early 2012, because that's key to destabilization that has occurred since throughout Europe, including impacting the Ukraine and Turkey. And so that was a fracturing of the opportunities, the relationship that was in place that could have gone differently. There was still an opportunity to mitigate some of the mistakes we made early on with Russia, but that did not happen. In fact, it went sideways, and it became very toxic in terms of the relationship. And I think that metastasized into 2012 when Putin made the decision to go into Crimea. And you can see how those things started playing out. Now, a lot of people, don't want to talk about it, but we've had advisors there for a long time. And you're dealing with a lot of the same players at state and parts of the, IC and DOD that were involved during that time period. There's a lot at stake, including their reputations, because that, and I warned what would happen. I warned back then in 2012 that the Russians would put boots on the ground in Syria and be in the Middle East. They didn't listen until it happened, right? And so I even put a plan forth how to deal with that in Syria, because I knew the cascade effects would destabilize all of Europe and that would spread. And when you look at that, right, when you look at the problems that are inherent, not only in the Middle East, but broader to the Caucasus, to the Asian plateau, to the east, and all the way into Europe proper, particularly Central Europe. That's a key point that people don't really connect the dots on, right? Because we have this tendency to go, oh, well, there's this situation here, and then there's this situation here, and these are the AORs, and those specialists know what they're doing. We don't see it as a comprehensive whole. That's still our problem, right? It's still the problem to such a degree that I left a Ukrainian work group yesterday on this, because they cannot break free to think you got to deal with the present and you got to deal with your actions in the present, meeting those needs, creating cascades in the future. If you don't do things right now, you can create larger problems in the future and more vulnerabilities. We're very short-term thinking, and this gets into our brother over here, Kass, right? Talking about China. I'll tell you what, where China is good is long-term, right? And they know that we are not.
3,000 years.
That's right. That's right. We think more like the fast food, checkout line or at the grocery store, right? Impulse buys, right? With our foreign policy. We're very reactive. We don't have a grand strategy as much as people like to talk about it. China actually has a grand strategy. And I would say that when people talk about World War II and then everything coming up through it to where we're at today and the haunting of people being, oh, we're in World War III. Well, we are on World War III. World War III was just a continuation of World War II because most wars, right, most of what is really war isn't obvious. What is obvious in war to most people is the smallest part of war, and that's the bombs and the body bags. And so what I would say is that if there's a point of that we could look at, right, as a bigger issue to us in the United States and even to Russia, and I would dare say even the Ukrainians and Europe at large, is what China's actually doing, because they're waging unrestricted warfare. And no one wants to talk about that now, particularly in this administration. My main AOR is Indo-Pacific, right? And the only way I would do that is that we didn't ignore our own CONUS, right? You got to think CONUS and OCONUS, right? We have to make sure that we protect our backyard and our back door is locked, as much as looking at what's happening a couple of neighborhoods over. And right now, we're not doing that. If you want to actually really see what the bigger issue is, and I'll just be blunt with you, I see Ukraine as much as I want to help the Ukrainian people, and I'm doing what I can to do that. It's a diversion, pure and simple. And when you look at it as a diversion for Europe and us and Russia, you only have a couple of options of who that really helps. And the biggest one is Beijing. Mm-hmm. And you want to talk about deaths, right? Yeah, 55,000 we lost in Vietnam. Well, we're losing more than twice that because of Chinese fentanyl and carfentanil. And let me put that into perspective for you, right? If we're going to talk about, be brutal, if we're going to talk real politic here, right? Let me tell you the war that you're actually in. 1 kilogram of carfentanil is enough to kill half of the Canadians in Canada. 1 kilogram. Because it's weapons grade, it's transdermal, it's aerosolable, and it's flooding our borders, right? So when you think about the real problems here, there's a reason why and I told Sam this, Sam's used to me saying this, I zig when everybody else zags. And there's a reason why I do that, because I found throughout history, when everybody's being diverted in the world one direction, you need to look at what's happening everywhere else. And you need to start with your own house. And right now, if you want to see what a national security threat is, go look at your borders. Look at your logistics and supply chains. If you want to see what a national security issue is, a true threat, you need to understand that the amount of carfentanil and fentanyl coming into this country is enough every single day to kill everybody on Earth multiple times. Now put that into context. That's a clear and present threat. You have a bigger issue.
That's a very big issue. And when you go into border security, and I want to go back to what you were just saying, because you were talking about with Russia, and they don't have a highway system and mostly rail. And when I was there a couple decades ago, I remember I actually took a train from Moscow to St. Petersburg, and that was 24 hours. But one thing I remember meeting, I think it was in Moscow, I met several people who were living there legally because they had domestic passports systems they had to deal with. And they were living illegally because they had no other way. But, one guy was a physical trainer or something. And interesting story. That's a side story. I'm not really bringing that up, but it goes back to when you compare that to the US in terms of borders and how it's everything, we have a major interstate system, with highways all over. And if you don't have the borders strongly managed, you have border patrols who are really starting to seem like they're losing morale and getting very concerned about the situation, and they're doing the best they can. But it is a national security situation, and you could say it's a policy thing. And one of our talking points was the Title 42 removal of the southern border Trump COVID policies. You're dealing with the people who are camped out, but you're also dealing with other people who are trying to get into the country as well. And I mean, that seems like in terms of smuggling and just bringing in people that haven't had a background check or something, it's a very dangerous concern.
Right. It turns into an insurgency is what it turns into.
Do you know what the numbers are?
I saw an article yesterday, but it's over. I want to say a number. I know it was over 1 million people waiting at the border to try and get in. And it would have created a backlog of over 7 years for anyone who is waiting at the border for an actual visa or approval to legally enter. That's
Well, the
right,
numbers. Yeah, you're absolutely right about the issue on it. The numbers, right? The official number, right? The official number of encounters, meaning direct encounters with Border Patrol agents and law enforcement since January of 2021 is something on the order of 2,355,000 across. And that's a small percentage of the amount of people that have come in. The reality is if you look at where the people are coming from, all over the world, including Russia, including China, and including Iran and other places. Now you can say, most of them are coming because of economic opportunities. That should tell you why it is they don't want to do anything about it in DC, but that's a whole nother discussion. But when they talk about the cartels and human trafficking, well, they're actually emboldening it. Because if you incentivize people to come here that way, you're creating chaos, and lawlessness is always going to take advantage of that chaos. So they've tied the hands of Border Patrol and ICE in general. We have the lowest in history of people being captured and sent back, deportations, in the history of the country right now. And so when you look at the numbers, right, let's look at this in terms of just from a basic logic point of view. If your borders are being flooded with drugs that are enough to kill everybody on the planet, and everybody has probably been exposed to one degree or another already, whether they realize it or not. Well, what do you think a real national security issue looks like when you deal with the border? Because you're creating the problem that's creating a cascade of more problems. Now you can say we need the folks if we're going to do like a decoupling from China, right? You need folks for manufacturing and all that. Okay, but there's a right way to do it. I know, because I'm sitting right here. Again, I'm not trying to be coy here. With the Borderland Security Modernization Conceptual Framework that they didn't want. I know because I wrote it, right? And it deals with how to deal with the supply chain and logistics side of the security issues and a humane and just way of dealing with immigration and people that need help and work visas. So you have to ask yourself, when they tell you one thing and you see what's actually occurring, what does that tell you about what's happening in DC? And this is not a political thing. Right? This is not left or right. They're both doing this to some degree and have for years. What does it tell you? Because the number one job of a government is protection of the people, enforcing laws, right? Making it so that everybody has an opportunity, right, for relative peace and security, protecting your borders, right? And dealing with lawlessness. If you don't have those things, you don't really have a government. What you have is a mirage of one. And right now, you should ask yourselves why that is and what's happened that we're not actually dealing with the issues that are actually most pertinent to the American people. Because I'll tell you what, a sick and addicted America is not one that actually can deal with any of the regions around the world, including Ukraine, including the Indo-Pacific, including the Middle East. And I can show you how groups like Wagner, Chinese triads, right, Iranian proxies, right, are all working together. So they know this in DC. So what's the problem? It should tell you, if you want to understand our foreign policy, you're going to have to understand how foolish our domestic one is, because those two things don't happen in a vacuum tube. They both are one thing. A coin has two sides. It's still one coin. And right now, we're making bad decisions across the board. And that, I think, is something that we all need to consider, how that affects all of us in the present time, our ability to act around the world, and what that looks like for the future of the country. Because if we're unwilling to do what we need to do to protect our own home, our own families and friends, right, our own homeland here, we have no business being in anybody else's backyard, much less their houses.
Yeah. Talking about foreign policy earlier, and that's why I was smiling and laughing inside, because wrapping up in Afghanistan, what I did in 2019 because of an injury, we, running teams for State Department, we're out there seeing everything on the street. We're the one flying across the country to have these meetings with people. And there's a few things that happened. Like the State Department fixed wing air contract was going, they were losing it. So they were going to have no access to Mazar Sharif and Herat, where we had two former consulates. And so we went out there to fly. We flew out there. I went to both to have meetings with them and to tell them, hey, the elections are coming up. We're not going to be able to access this part of the country until we get these helicopters in that can fly the distance. But we're not going to abandon you guys. But we want you guys to know that we support you. Maz was first, and then Herat was last. And I was in Herat when we shut down the consulate. We shut it down a year after we got attacked. And the key point with Herat was the proximity that we had to Iran and everything there. And, seeing some of the people that were there and their reactions when we spent $60 million to refurbish the consulate after the attack, and they flat out told the SCR, no, we're going to stay here on the airbase because we have drinking buddies here. We don't like it there because we're by ourselves. That really set the precedent. And he didn't have much of a foot to stand on prior to the attack because he came in the night of the attack. He landed the night before and it kicked off at 5:30 in the morning. So he didn't really get to see everything beforehand. But then we shut down and go to Kabul. And for years, we're telling them, hey, there's issues. You guys can't, we got the outer ring, the iron ring has issues. And we can't keep doing it. We can't keep trusting this. And so their mission started changing. And I was flying back on the night the 2016 elections were announced. I was between UAE and Pakistan. And a friend messaged me and goes, hey, just so you know, at this point, I still had no clue who won the election. But they're like, hey, just so you know, everyone is mad right now because Hillary lost. Okay, well, what's the big deal? He goes, no, you don't understand. He goes, they had cakes and everything pre-made because they all wanted her to win. They all planned it. And they were telling all the contractors and everyone from state who had a little bit of support for Trump, you can't do that. I'm biased politically. And they're like, okay. So I land and immediately the atmosphere changed with not only State Department, but DOD too. Because while I was working as a liaison between DOS and DOD, the DOD side, the new long tab general took over for RS. And we had a huge attack happen in Kandahar. And they were trying to push it as a clear and let it go. And he came in to the operations center and goes, no, he goes, we're not doing that. We're not going to clear this up just to let them retake the ground again. And it turned into a 7-day operation. And that's when I could tell, for me, that the military was actually going to do what they were supposed to do. They were going to they went on the offensive for the first time in a long time. And it was a joint coalition soft operation. And it started that way. The foreign policy side retreated. And I always say retreated. The amount of mission critical meetings that happened were minuscule. And we were seeing more meetings for parties. We have this social gathering, and we're like, how is this justifiable? And they're like, well, it's none of your problem. Well, no, I have to work 12 hours and I have to make sure we get you back. Fine. So why are we spending so long at this embassy for a drinking party? And I'm not going to go into some of the details because some of the requests, if an IG report came out on what happened between 2016 election and the failure, the foreign policy for me has been non-existent since I left Baghdad in 2008. And it was very sketchy then too, but they refused to listen to us. We're like, you have an issue with the Afghan military, with the Afghan police. You have governors and Supreme Court justices taking more money than what they're supposed to. And there's an issue with the security. Oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about. We're like, okay, when's the last time you've been on the road? When's the last time you drove around the city? Oh, that's right. You can't. You have to fly. You have to pay $15,000 for a 5-minute helicopter ride from the embassy to the airport just so you can fly out. You can't drive the 30-minute drive that it takes because there's so many checkpoints and it's unsafe for you, but we can drive it day to day and we're expendable. And that has really thrown me away from foreign policy altogether because it's not been, we've become the laughingstock of the world because, like you said, we can't take care of our own issues. And everyone's like, well, who are you to tell us what to do when you guys can't even get your own stuff straight in your own country and you can't protect your own borders, but you're going to tell us, hey, we need to tighten down the border on Iran and Pakistan. But you guys
isn't that exactly the narrative being used against us? Mm-hmm. Right, by everybody, right? That's hostile or a near peer, right? And you illustrated. Yeah,
I've had guys in Afghanistan for meeting POCs at the presidential compound. He walks up, he's like, hey, I need to check this. Why are you telling me what to do? You can't keep your own country in check.
Well, I think
I'm in your country. I'm not in my country right now. It's like, and that's out of my control. I can control this.
That's definitely an issue of how perceptions from mass media or narratives. And I remember one thing in the first podcast, it was mentioned the U.S. has a great deal of soul searching if it wants to really tackle China. It was over Myanmar, but in terms of foreign policy, soul searching. But it reminds me several years ago in something I was reporting on something I wrote. Back then, the BRICS were a big buzzword, and all of a sudden with Ukraine, it started with that Ukraine and people, abstaining over Russia or buying Russian oil, stuff like that. The whole buzzword of BRICS is making a return, I suppose. If you don't know what BRICS are, it's, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and all those countries that are, developing and all that. But the whole thing with the BRICS people were talking about a few years back was how you have a West, East, North, South thing going on here. And you have perceptions. And if, with the US as a unipolar power or the sole superpower after the Cold War, it means what kind of message are you sending in terms of how you're managing affairs of the world or as a world leader? And an Indian politician, actually, he was a former secretary general at the UN, or not secretary, assistant secretary. It was there when I was at the UN working with NGOs, Shashi Tharoor. He's now, I think, Indian politician now, or probably does a few other stuff too. But he was saying, it's really about who tells the best story. And right now, China, maybe even Russia, I don't know, I'm not going to say Russia, but China at least is telling a story in terms of how are you going to find stability in the international system? Who's going to be more consistent, security. And that is a big concern for the West if they're not presenting that type of picture or narrative, if it's conflicting. And it's a very complicated system. There's systems that are still in place that work, but you have things being, if it's a stress test, you have fractures, you have systems that have been working for decades. But if perception changes, especially people in regions that you operated in, Dustin, or anywhere else, if that's all they see, they're in a war zone. They're in a place where whoever is controlling, the environment reigns supreme. And if the picture of the people who are supposedly helping them, that's the image, they're going to be very judgmental, even more so. And people here in the West or the US, they're not going to notice it as much as they probably should, because a lot of that is going to have major ramifications.
If anything, I would like to weigh in on both your talking points, Mr. Daves and you, Dustin. It seems I pretty much just moved to DC, but the points you made looks like there's a lot of ineffective bureaucracy going on within the domestic and foreign policy areas. Part of me was wondering if this does seem to be a shift in the changing attitudes between the left and the right in politics, possibly, or sometimes there's changes in administration that affects the other organizations that fall under it, or it could be that we are kind of simply in disarray because we do not have much of a grand strategy as we did previously. It looks like over here that many of the organizations seem to have very competitive edges. Like I remember one of my former mentors telling me that sometimes organizations do not like to cooperate well with each other. He one time said, you think talking with the Russians is hard. Think of how bad it is between playing liaison between two different agencies. That's one of the things that he told. And on the domestic front, I do think we need to focus more over here before we can take care of ourselves abroad. And yes, it's kind of like how one hand watches the other. Like whatever is being done over here is going to kind of be done elsewhere. Certain attitude shifts, certain ways in management. And I think because of specifically the weird narratives being done as of the last two administrations, we are kind of a bit of a country that's more divided and unwilling or unknown into how we should handle ourselves. Like in DC, it seems like the reason as to this is because sometimes no one really wants to regulate it or handle certain issues.
I would say that you're dead on. I mean, every single thing that you said, right, I would say is something I've experienced personally. The leadership thing is interesting, right? I mean, we kind of get into human nature, right? Again, another reason why I always say, as for people, so too for nations, because nations are made of people, right? And governments are run by them, and bureaucracies are filled with them. When you have convergence of things, which we're dealing with, and I would dare say that this COVID-19, a lot of people would point to that and go, well, that's kind of created a disarray. I think what it did is it actually brought everything to the surface. The dysfunction's been there. The corruption's been there. The incompetencies have been there. And there's been a slow leaching of poison into the system across branches and across agencies and departments. And that's natural. I mean, entropy is a part of this world, right? So, I mean, we shouldn't think that our government structures or even our society at large is immune from it. However, you did bring up something that's really important. I think you could probably unpack it even more if you want to, but that is hyperpoliticization. There's no central middle ground, and that is unique. I mean, there's always been a common middle ground where people that actually cared more about the country, and even those that would tag along, that it's really about them, but it's good for their reputations to go that direction, right? Could form up to do what was necessary and to have consensus. What has occurred, and it's interesting because you brought up, Hillary Clinton was brought up just a little earlier, right there, brother. It's amazing what happens when you have power and you have corruption and you have entitlement and bitterness. You bring those things together. Is it any wonder that what we're experiencing here, right, is a cup of our own making? Because that's exactly what their policies did to other nations, including Russia. And I'm not covering Russia on going into Ukraine and the crimes and the things that have been done there, right? But when I look at things, I look at the totality of them, and I look at the micros and the macros and how things get to where they are. And the system, as you kind of pointed out, the bureaucracies function by shielding the public from that and shielding their own thinking from that, because that means they have to take responsibility for their own choices and actions. Afghanistan is a great example of us trying to do something that was half measured, not thought out, and corrupted from the very first. If we'd got in, done what we said we were going to do, and leave, we wouldn't have a lot of these issues. If we were going to get in and nation build, and we did it right, and it took responsibility for it, right? Instead of trying to have it both ways. Oh, we're not doing this. Now, you're going to take over a country, right? You better bet your rear end that you're going to be there for the next 100 years. I mean, you're really going to nation build. Now, people say, well, that's not what America does. Really? What do you think NATO is? What do you think Europe is? How long have we been there? I mean, if we're going to actually address issues, to your point, right, we're going to have to address them as they are. And that's precisely what you were told, and the things you're seeing in DC, they don't do. They live in a bubbledom of bureaucratic, stupefaction. And the problem with all human beings, including me, right, is we all have to deal with the vulnerabilities we have in our own mortal coils towards being arrogant, corrupted, foolish. And nowhere in history is that more apparent than in governance. That's why we continue to have wars, and we continue to create the conditions for them. And it's exactly why it is that I can tell you that, I said this last night to a group on the Ukraine, right, which upset them, but nothing here happens in a vacuum. Nothing is disconnected from anything else. It's a sphere. We can pretend all day long that they're in little, airtight boxes, but that's not reality. Nothing here is like that, particularly in the natural order. And then when you look at that from a frame of reference from governance and policy, right, decision-making and actions, right, and all the things that go into that in a society, Sam will tell you again, I always bring up something called the 7 spheres of society. There's a reason why I do that, because those are the key 7 areas in a society. If you lose them, you've lost your country. You're dysfunctional, and ultimately you're destroyed. And people don't like that, right? We have on both sides our own versions of political correctness, the left and the right. It just plays out in different ways. And then we also have our power of positive thinking, right? And then we have our straw man that we like to point out on the other side. So what we have, and it always comes down to this, as Sam knows, is the binary simulacrum. We live in a 2-headed snake. And anything that's double-minded is never going to actually have any consistency and get anywhere. I mean, if you have 2 people trying to drive the same bus, there's a pretty good chance You're going to flip the thing, or it's going to go off the road and everybody's going to be in a wreck, right? And the way our system's meant to function is not as a binary simulacrum. It's to force compromise. And when either side of the political spectrum decides they're not willing to do that, well, you no longer have the system that you were promised. You don't have a representative democracy. What you have is a single party state fighting the others to make it so. And when you divide the country, right, if you're a leader, your job is to lead everybody and do it by example. And if the people that are charged with electing people to those positions don't have any idea what that is, well, they just elect reflections of themselves. And as the society becomes more and more infected, right, and entropy, it sets up exponentially, well, what kind of leaders do you think they choose? And then what do you think rises up to manipulate them to give them exactly what they think they want? That's what you live in. That's how our government is functioning, as a dysfunctional Hulk. It is a beast. It's the very thing our founding fathers in this country founded it not to be. Now, I got something from the State Department today. They were talking about some kind of event where they were talking about, healthcare and a universal healthcare in the United States. That is not their role. I'm sorry, regardless of what I think about the issue, that is not their role. That's not their job. That's not what they were established to do. What you have is you have confusion, and you have a policy-making system that's based off of chaos and cannibalism. So we're going to be honest about it. And it's not just the cannibalism of other nations, it's our own people. I personally, have gotten into a lot of debates, and a lot of people get frustrated with me because I'm more realpolitik than the people that actually teach it. Because my version of realpolitik doesn't discount things like worldview and the realities of human nature. It actually looks at that as the starting piece. And when you look at what we've become as a nation, I love this country. And there are a lot of amazing people in the government across all the areas, right? IC, DOD, the civilian side, you name it. The problem is we become corrupted at a bureaucratic level, and it's become endemic. A great example of that, if you want to know, is what happened with the United States Secret Service. You should go and look on my LinkedIn. I put it up. Now, I warned them 5 months ago after they did a political hit on me and my family on an anonymous tip. If you know anything about that department, that agency, that's not how you do things, especially when your job is to protect the leaders. So I warned them that they had been compromised. They got busted. And I only bring that up not because of me. I bring that up is I could give you example after example. So could he about Afghanistan. If we were to dive into Afghanistan, we'd be on here for the next week and not even get to the bottom of how corrupt the whole thing was. And it's because people were creating their own Shangri-La in their own ways, right? They didn't care about the people. The ones who did, right, couldn't get anything done. That's why it was a wreck. And you have to ask yourself, who did we do that for? Well, who was already on the ground? Who was making money there? And then who was right by it? China. We've been China's foreign policy and their active boots on the ground more than anybody in DC wants to actually acknowledge. That's why they don't want to talk about China right now. That's why they don't want to admit at the DOD or the IC. The DEA will do it, I'll tell you. But the leaders that are protecting their reputations don't want to tell you you're in already a war. It's the greatest war this country's ever faced, and we already have the greatest casualties that we've ever had in a war. And it's all civilians almost, and it's still happening. And that's just with synthetic opiates. That's just synthetic opiates. That's not counting all the other things. And the cascade effects from that are damaging far beyond the immediate. And when you want to tie this back, because I know that Sam's going to want to tie this up and in this, so let me try to tie everybody's pieces together, right? How does this work with Russia? How does this work with Ukraine? Well, how do you think a lot of those oligarchs got their money?
it was a very corruptive process.
Uh-huh.
If you really want a
Where do you-
good, go ahead.
No, I said that's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, a book I'm always promoting is if you really want to understand a lot of the corruption that took place in the 90s in Russia, read Paul Klebnikov's book. It actually is about the work he does on covering Boris Berezovsky and Roman Abramovich, who Berezovsky's dead. But Abramovich has been in the news over Ukraine lately. But the whole process, not just with Berezovsky, who actually is probably the reason why Putin came to power. But other than that, I would say that's a very good book, Godfather of the Kremlin. But it was all corruption and also bad advice in terms of how they were trying to privatize all their industries. But there was already a lot of corruption before the Soviet Union fell. So a lot of the people who saw the writing was on the wall started prepping and preparing. And
that's kind of the whole thing with Yeltsin, right? I mean, which really that's the public side of what you just said, right?
If I may, I didn't mean to go into turning this into a corruption topic, but I do find it a little interesting how you brought that up. I would have thought that we wouldn't really have so much of this issue really permeating our society and our branches in the United States, since we were founded with a checks and balance system, weren't we? I mean, we have the Supreme Court. We are supposed to pride ourselves in accountability and transparency within this nation. The hyperpoliticization is a big issue because it's divided and created an increased amount of marginalization within American society, unfortunately, which we thought would have probably never happened in the first place. I think the big question is, why haven't we really used those checks and balances systems more effectively, or pretty much, as the saying goes, really drained the swamp in political circles?
Right, in terms of what the right would say, yeah. Right. Well, that's a great question. And Sam, do you want to take this first, and then, or do you want me to just say it real quick, and then I'll just kind of bow out because I know we need to wrap this up. But
how about you say it, and I'll give a response. How about that? And
okay,
Dustin
all right.
Something too, or
yeah, because I think everybody has something to say on this right now, right? We can talk another month. Go ahead. Well, why don't you go? Go ahead, brother.
I got one small bit on this because it ties into Afghanistan.
Right.
And during my undergrad, I did international relations class, and I brought up this checks and balances issue novel because they're like, the part of the assignment was writing an issue to a local government member on an issue and how can it be fixed. And at the time, John Kerry was Secretary of State, and I was in Afghanistan, and I wrote it to him. And I wrote it, and I was like, why are we still throwing all this money to Afghanistan, and there's no checks and balances? There's no goalpost like what we had with the 2008 financial crisis in the US, where all these banks had to repay these certain amounts by a certain period of time. So why are we throwing billions of dollars into this country and there's no goalpost for them to hit? And I was pretty much threatened with my job if I sent it to them.
That's because we're not a whole lot different than Russia. We just are more we've been more clever at hiding it. I mean, the checks and balances are part of it. I mean, they're very complex. When people, you literally could study years to look at all the pieces that went into it and how it really works and understand the psychology and sociology. And again, that's kind of where the seven spheres comes from, because they're key to this. But over time, anything is subject to entropy. And we don't have the time to really develop how we got here fully, but it really has its ties. It is connected to all of this stuff with Ukraine and Russia, in that when you're in like the 20th century, if you look, there's a cycle, right? And it's interesting because it's also dealing with drugs and addiction. Well, typically after every war, you have cycles of addiction. This is historical. right? You also, with that addiction comes moral and ethical impacts and social impacts that affect the whole society. And then, you have boom bust cycles, right? And if you start you identify all these patterns, these cycles, and you start laying them out on a timeline, it's actually very ordered, much more than people would like to see. And when you see the impacts, particularly of the Cold War, right? A great person, like Russia's always had a Rasputin, no matter who the leader is. Some are more well-known than others, right? So for Stalin, his Rasputin was Beria. And he helped develop the plan to bring down the West. He was an evil bastard. But he was actually successful in some ways because it's kind of what's happened. They wanted to rot us from within. And it's easy to do that with the nation state when it's done under the guise of other things, and it's done covertly, and you feed it poison. And the word for that in ancient Greek is pharmakia. It's where we get the word pharmacy from, or pharmaceutical. And it means to drug or poison. And that was key. But it's not just that. That's like carpet bombing to prepare the information battlefield, right? Because it makes people more susceptible to corruptive influences. And when the money from it starts flowing in, which is what locks it in. Oh, well, we can't solve addiction. We might as well make money on it, right? I mean, people are going to use drugs. So they open the floodgates and they create a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the amount of money propping up the global system that's illegal monies from criminal operations would stagger your mind, including our own Wall Street. That's how integrated it is. And that has an aggregated effect across the government, because what do you have to do? What do you have to get control of to be able to keep the elite? Well, government. And there's a lot of things, as people that have been on the darker side of having to do operations will tell you, you have to deal with a lot of unsavory people. And you deal with that side of things because that's the land of espionage and arms trafficking and intel and all kinds of other stuff. And over time, all it takes is a few to really get corrupted by it. And then it starts the metastasization within the systems. And then it becomes ingrained in the bureaucracy. And when you have a population, here's the other side, that doesn't even understand what the checks and balances are. Brother, they have not taught anything about what this country is for the majority of our lives. Mostly what I learned about our country, I didn't learn in school, right? I learned
from
teaching
Gary
myself.
Cooper movies.
Right. Right. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, you don't arrive here overnight, right? Rome didn't fall overnight. It was corrupted over time. And that's why they did put checks and balances in. And believe it or not, some of them are still sort of working. We're not fully down and out yet,
Well, I think with checks and balances, it's like policy can be money, but it's also you're using a policy to skirt the checks and balance issues. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. And you kind of see where things are going. And it's like with Ukraine, and you're talking about sending all these arms to help them fight. And that's something I wonder if, like, at some point the Russians are going to hold a very big grudge for having done that, depending on how many lives they have. But in terms of a policy, I think it was today, a headline was talking about Slovakia sending S-300s to Ukraine. My first thought was, well, that means they're going to be getting more funding for more advanced, more expensive, weaponry to make up for that, because S-300s is an outdated version. I think it's the S-400 now. That is the big promotion of Russian weaponry. but if it's about money or if it's also about policy, because you could say that they're sending all these arms because they think they're going to get newer stuff, but also to create a stalemate probably. But for checks and balances, I think you just, a policy here or there, no one's going to really bat an eyelash. They'll say, well, we're taking one for the team or something. But that stuff does add up in spheres of influences, and you can weigh how, from every sphere, how that impacts society. And like you said, it's like in terms of learning about the country, or the people grew up with the in Saturday morning cartoons, like What's a Bill, or what's that? I can't think of it. The jingle doing, I'm a Bill.
Oh yeah, Schoolhouse Rock.
Schoolhouse Rock, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, they don't.
You learn more from that than you do anything else in school now.
But yeah, I think if you have more of stuff like that, I think you could say that, it's an agenda to change the way how people are learning or thinking. But, it could be you just, we have a society that has a lot of options. We love our options. We love having, 31 different flavors at Baskin Robbins, or I don't know what they have. I haven't been to one in ages, but we love doing, having that. But we always had a bit of a compass, we had a strong compass in terms of, we know what we stand for, what we're dealing with. And if you are familiar, I know you are, Max, I'm sure Dustin is, and I think Brian and Nabil might be, but Yuri Bezmenov, who talks about Soviet subversion back during the Cold War, and he was doing these classes, how they take over countries, and creating a culture of useful idiots so that they could take over and have control. He was doing that in the 80s, and if you listen to the crowd, I mean, he had a sense of humor, but if you look at the crowd, they're like, okay, this is interesting, but it could never happen here. In this day and age, I don't think people would say, oh, it could never happen in terms of, culture or spheres of influence being, compromised in some aspect. I think, and it tells you where people stand, because, I mean, I'm not talking about politicization, but in terms of just keeping things running in a society, if that makes sense.
Well, there's a lot of complexity, right? And where you have complexity, I mean, you also have more vulnerability towards entropy, right? And in the natural order, right, there's a natural balancing. And that's, I mean, the founding fathers were fascinating in that they studied the natural order. And so they looked at creation, right, natural order, and they looked at, Western civilization and Judeo-Christian principles, and tried to harmonize all of those things into something that at least they understood their own corruption, which they proved in some of their lives very well, which proves the wisdom, right, and the fact that they did want to have checks and balances. And what happens in organizations, I mean, I put forth a concept in terms of coordinating various things for Ukraine. And I said, one of the reasons that you need to do this is you need to have checks and balances, right? You need to have accountability, because there are a lot of people that want to get involved and want to help, but there's also a lot of people, it's also part of war, to plunder them, right? And so again, when you've got entropy across all those buckets, it sets up, people don't think. They don't think through things, and they don't have vision to see past their immediate needs. They become very instinctual. That's why I use the word beast. It's beastly, right? Animals are instinct driven. And when you become that way in your thinking, and you're a decision maker, or your organization does, you become a devourer, right? And so it's all about you. It's not about the mission. It's not about your people, right? It's not about the nation, right? And That's the problem with careerism. That's the problem with entrenched bureaucratic and elitism that sets up in it. I mean, there's a reason why you see the same last names across the government. You should ask yourself why that is. And here's the thing, both sides blame one another for the same damn things that they do. They do it differently though, right? There is some variety, right? But that's what people do. And that's exactly what governments and nation states do. Because no one actually really wants to deal with themselves, because that actually requires something of you, right? It requires you taking responsibility, and that's tough for people to do. And it's even tougher for nations. Now, America has been traditionally pretty good about taking responsibility for stuff because our checks and balances system forced it, right? If there's one beef I have with Russia is they've never taken responsibility for their stuff, you know, and China even more so. So if I was like, you know, a judge sitting in a courtroom, as screwed up as America is, I would have to say that if I was judging between the three, at least America tried to actually right the ship in some ways. But it wouldn't be not culpable for the things that it's done, because we're paying the consequences. Those consequences are sown in your actions, in your choices, your decisions, whether it's individuals, right? No matter where they are in society, from the micros to the macros. And nation states pay it as well. And we are paying consequences for things that we have allowed to happen. To have this form of government, you have to have an informed and actively participating, morally grounded, foundational, right, ethically, to have it. You know, I mean, I'm known for saying, you know, I'm not bound. I mean, if it's about survivability, well, you have the worst form of government when you have a corrupted people. So that's where China's nailing you to the wall, right? That's where Russia, all these oligarchs are seeing the writing on the wall here if we don't get it together. And it's emboldening them. And what do you think the future is going to be? Well, it's war as a service. And if I've got $50 billion, I can go buy me an army and I'm going to take that land over there, because in the middle of chaos, there's always something that's going to fill it. Now, you should think about that in the direction we're heading, right? Because that's the direction we're heading. Ask anybody who's been to Afghanistan or any other place that's turned into total chaos.
Well, it's like the financial investing phrase: if there's blood on the street, you want to buy, sell what, or buy on fear, sell on greed, or if there's blood on the street, you know, start buying up. And I think that's what we're seeing. And it's an old mentality, but I think
that's a multipolar world. That's what the world has been for eons.
Yeah.
Just
Even
bigger
during
consequences.
The Roman Empire, there was a multipolar world. There were other empires they dealt with.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the Silk Road, which has been a part of all of them, ironically enough.
Well, and you know, it's going to be really interesting to see how China utilizes its relationships, because I think it's going to be a stress test for them, depending. I mean, I think they would still use it to do whatever they can, but it depends if they tell the story that is going to sell the people who have these relationships with, that are more into their advantage, more so. If they decide to sell it, to buy into it, or to leave it. And it's like with Sri Lanka, I was telling people, it was like last year actually, they have these ports, but there could ultimately be a way to basically take away the arrangement where they have with Beijing to, I think, to lease it for 100 years or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's fallen through.
Yeah, at the time it hadn't, but
yeah. Well, Sam, things could turn around really quick, because no one wants to actually be a tribute state to China.
No.
I mean, if anything, China it has an overblown version. It's fractured itself too, like we've talked about before, because it got lured into exposing itself. They always do. But if America got itself together, you would see things change dramatically for the better for everybody. Because even Russia would rather be connected and closer to us. And even most of them would rather be connected to us, even Iran. But it's the leadership. Again, it goes back to corrupting the leader, elite capture. You want to study something to really focus on in terms of how we got here, really dig into elite capture and how that happens, because that's really what's occurred. And it's occurred in the public and private sectors. But we can turn this around, but it's not going to be without costs, and it's not going to be without taking risk. And we're going to have to be brutally honest.
What's that famous quote by Churchill about America?
Yeah, my favorite one, right? By the way, Zelensky is not a Churchill, but that's another day, another story. They started using that narrative after I posted something on LinkedIn, an article I kind of wrote, a mini thing on Churchill and why you don't have Churchills, ironically enough. They're not very original, are they?
We lost that a long time ago.
Right. Well, yeah, one of my favorite quotes by Churchill is, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've done everything else first. Probably a good place to end, don't you think?
Oh, that's a beautiful place.
Or maybe begin. Guys, I appreciate it. I mean, thank you for having me. I would love to talk to you guys more. I mean, it sharpens me because I like hearing your perspectives on stuff. It's really good I need that, right? I need to be sharpened, right? And your experiences and your points of view are very, very important to me, especially if we're going to be charged with having to put the pieces together, right? And I think it's going to be left to us. And I think we can do it. But, we building these relationships like we're doing now is really important. If there's one thing I've learned, and I told the folks in the group this, with the working group with Ukraine, is that the reason why this isn't working is no one knows anybody. Nobody actually has a pre-established relationship of any meaningful depth. So what Sam does here and how you guys are interacting and we've interacted tonight, I mean, that provides firm foundation, especially when things get really thick and things get tough, because we all need one another, right? This isn't about me. It isn't about you. It's about us, right? With that, I'm out of here. Sam, thank you.
Thanks, Max. Appreciate it. All of you guys too. It was very rich, very enriching conversation, as someone said. Well, that concludes our discussion today. Once again, I'd like to thank Mark, Max, Dustin, Nabil, and Brian for taking the time to prepare and speak at this roundtable episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast. It was an insightful discussion and a firm reminder that there's always more going on in the world than one might realize. That's one of the key goals of this podcast because, well, that's just what we do around here. Also, it is a firm reminder that in these times, it is essential to keep sharpening one's edge and to continue building one's arsenal of knowledge, skill sets, and mindsets for being ready and capable for difficult times whenever they may occur. For example, this roundtable episode was not what we originally had in mind. However, an emergency came up and we remained resilient and adaptable, which led to a successful 5th episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast. I personally would like to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this podcast. There will be more to come, so be on the lookout and check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us. And feel free to subscribe to our channel. So on that note, I bid you all farewell. Until the next time, stay safe, sane, and savvy. Bye.